Welcome to Lawyer and Layman Explain It. This is a show where we discuss topics related to law and social justice from the perspective of a layperson who has blissfully ignorant delusions of grandeur about life and the way things work, and
someone who survived the Hunger Games of law school and taking a bar exam, and gratefully only has minor battle scars, but major student loan debt. Before we dive into our episode, quick disclaimer. This podcast is for educational purposes only and is not intended to provide any legal advice. If you need legal advice, you might want to pause this podcast and find a lawyer.
But then come back. Please come back.
Any inaccuracies are unintentional and facts could change at any time. Do your own research.
Welcome everyone to the pod. Since this is our very first episode, we're going to tell you a little bit about ourselves. My name is Martin, and I, like your average U.S. resident, have delusions of grandeur and a false sense of confidence and really no understanding of how the law works.
And my name's Kasey.
Esquire.
So Martin said I should introduce myself as an Esquire, but that, I don't know, everyone. I mean, I feel like that sounds kind of pretentious, bougie. Would love to know what you all think. Anyway, I am a cybersecurity lawyer at a tech company. I have a background as litigator at a law firm. A litigator is a person whose law practice involves preparing for trials and other things that happen in a courtroom. I also spent some time assisting a judge with research and writing, that's known as clerking, after law school. Today, we're going to talk about gerrymandering, also called redistricting, although the latter name is much less fun. Note that our goal is to make this podcast accessible to non-lawyers, so we will be breaking down and defining terms and concepts. For lawyers, this might be basic stuff, but we encourage you to stay tuned in. You might still learn something new. Before we get to the juicy stuff, Martin, tell me where you think the word gerrymander comes from. We at Lawyer and Layman Explain It love words, by the way.
We do love words. Full disclosure. Since we've been talking about it, I actually do know the origins of the word. But thinking back to what I would have thought previously, I feel like it might be a Southern term to like jerry rig something. And so gerrymandering and maybe the context that comes with it, from my understanding of what it means, I always kind of thought jerry was like they're working something that's not through proper means, but kind of slapping something together.
You know, I didn't think of it that way, but that makes total sense. And that is not far from how the term came to be and what it does today. But we'll get into the origin story. So it all starts with a founding father that most of us have probably never heard of. My guy's name was Elbridge Gerry. And despite writing my master's thesis on Eurocentrism and patriarchy in early American foundational texts, such as the Declaration of Independence and Federalist Papers, yes, I said that all in one breath. So yeah, I don't remember this guy, despite doing that research. Gerry was described in a 1976 biography as nervous and bird-like, so I'm getting kind of penguin vibes from him. And much like the penguin, Gerry himself has a fascinating villain origin story, leading up to being the vice president of the United States.
Wow.
We won't spend much time on that part, but I encourage everyone to look it up. The important thing for today's discussion is Gerry, as the governor of Massachusetts in 1812, signed a bill codifying his political cronies' redrawings of political districts. And prior to the haphazard reshaping, Senate districts followed county boundaries, which, that seems completely logical. But after Gerry's Democratic-Republican buddies picked up their crayons, the state political district map looked a total, utter hot mess. So, in a tale as old as time, salty members of the opposing party hosted a dinner party shortly after Gerry signed the bill in 1812. And I picture them all looking like that Leo DiCaprio from Django Unchained meme. You know, the one where he's drunkenly laughing and holding up a glass like... And so someone said that Gerry's redistricting map looked like a salamander. Then someone else retorted, in what would become a historic burn, no, a gerrymander. And that's how we got to this term that's still used today. Thoughts, Martin?
Oh, Gerry. I had no idea it had such an extensive background. I also didn't know that Juicy Tibbet that was named after somebody. Like, what a notorious I don't know, life fact that you had this, what we now know to be a pretty terrible thing associated with your name. Like, what a legacy.
Quite the legacy. So, Martin, now that you've heard this fascinating backstory of how we got to the word, how would you define what gerrymandering is?
Yeah. So as a layman, gerrymandering comes up during like election season, which we're actually in during the recording of this. But yeah, it's associated with kind of like manipulating votes. Yeah, and I believe it's like about redrawing lines to favor your party, which I think is kind of something difficult to grapple with. I know there's some great visuals online, and maybe we can link them. But if you draw your map such that the majorities of different areas are changed, like you can manipulate votes. It's a little bit easier to see it visually. But I've seen a report in the news too, or seen headlines where maybe they have a screenshot of a district and it just maybe it looks like a gerrymander. It looks just like some amorphous blob as opposed to maybe a less biased drawing of like separation of accounting or something like that. But yeah, I mean, essentially, it has kind of a slimy feel to it. It sounds like a political party maneuvering to gain an unfair, unrepresentative advantage.
That's a pretty solid definition. For my friends who might be new to the United States and still catching up on our, how shall I say, quirky history, or who just like definitions, very similar to what Martin described, a great July 2023 article from the American Bar Association, or ABA, defines gerrymandering as a district map for Congress or for a state legislature, county commission, and the like that is intentionally designed to enhance the power of one political party at the expense of the other, regardless of how the people of the jurisdiction may choose to vote in a given election. Hearing that definition, Martin, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, isn't that what politics is? There's all sorts of underhanded rule bending or backstabbing. But frankly, it sounds undemocratic. Like we've failed to live up to these ideals in so many ways. But one of the core foundations, I think, of democracy of our country is that people have equal votes. One man, one person, excuse me, one vote. And this seems to be, the antithesis to that.
Love that correction, by the way. So, I've personally never felt a good feeling when I heard the word gerrymandering. So I was excited to have the opportunity to dive a little deeper for this episode. And I want to talk a bit about why this is a thing that's still in use today, often at the detriment of low income folks and people of color. And it all starts with a little thing we know as the Supreme Court of the United States. As you might guess, there's some really bad Supreme Court precedent in the realm of gerrymandering. In fact, before I dive into sort of a high level view of some of those cases, let me read you this quotation also from that ABA article that I mentioned. Although the U.S. Supreme Court has undermined the rule of law in a whole variety of areas, its treatment of partisan gerrymandering is arguably the most destructive. The reason is that gerrymandering is the one area of the law where the court itself acknowledges that state and local officials are regularly violating the Constitution, but it has refused to allow any federal judicial remedy. And it has done that based solely on the highly debatable suggestion that it is just too difficult to establish standards for separating lawful from unlawful conduct. So, Martin, I'm guessing you don't have like the warmest and fuzziest feelings, but tell me how that ABA quotation makes you feel.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, before even talking about that, once we got the definition of gerrymandering and we know it's a thing, and in this day and age, with technology, information sharing, it's a wonder, like, how is that even legal? And then hearing that the Supreme Court essentially rubber stamps it is terrible, and their reason makes no sense. You're the highest court in the land, but it's too difficult. Like that, it just seems like a scapegoat or an easy excuse that it's too hard. We'll leave it up to these corrupt people to continue being corrupt. Yeah, a story as old as time.
So I want our listeners to know that we're not going to get deep into the case law. This is a fairly short podcast, but we'll jump into some highlights in case you needed a reason to be deeply upset about the state of U.S. politics. Keep in mind that a lot of this comes from Ballotpedia, and that's a resource that you can find online that has information about judges, about court decisions, etc.
As you
Ballot
come to vote in this election season, Ballotpedia is actually a really useful resource. We here at Lawyer and Layman Explain It definitely advocate for exercising your right so long as we have it. Even if you feel it's meaningful, it's a good exercise to take part of. And we definitely advocate for local elections as those often have the most impact on our lives as individuals. I say all that because I use Ballotpedia all the time. It's so confusing. It's so hard. It takes a lot of effort, even using some of these nice resources, but I think it's worth the effort, at least to be informed. So, yes, I'm also an advocate of Ballotpedia as a layman.
Excellent. That's great. I think it's fantastic and a fantastic resource for helping folks to have in more digestible language an understanding about what's happening in our judicial system and throughout society. Ballotpedia has a helpful timeline of redistricting cases, but keep in mind it is a secondary source. That means it didn't come from the primary resource, the primary place where the information came from. So, as we always say here at Lawyer and Layman, explain it. Do your own research and don't just rely on our little summary here today. So, to start with some of the earlier cases, there were cases from the mid 20th century in the gerrymandering context. Many of the earlier Supreme Court cases, interestingly, so I want to focus in the period of the 1960s, were decided in favor of the party that brought the claims of unfair redistricting. And quick aside for our listeners who are non-lawyers, the party that initiates a lawsuit is the plaintiff, except in criminal cases. There's different nomenclature there. So the plaintiffs often had the beneficial results from 1960s Supreme Court cases.
So it sounds
Martin,
like
I was just going to ask, any guesses on why the Supreme Court cases of the 60s had better outcomes for folks that claim they were being harmed by redistricting?
that's a good question. Yes, clearly I'm excited. I really am a law nerd. I was going to say, it sounds like in the 60s, the right people were winning. They were saying this is wrong. And the Supreme Court said, you know what, you're right. We'll go ahead and make some of these changes and send them back. And to your question of why there was more success, I mean, and the reason that anything gets done in the United States is the political climate was accepting of it. That was a time of social progress within the United States, the civil rights movement, in 64, the Civil Rights Act. That would be my guess, but I can't quite think of any other reason. Maybe Vietnam. Like, I'm trying to think of what else is going on that would actually be influential enough for change to happen.
You're hitting the nail on the head. So the climate in the 1950s and 1960s was, in terms of Supreme Court case decisions, considered one of the most, if not the most, liberal periods. So you see cases that have been the seminal cases for sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion, a term that we utilize now. You had Brown versus Board. You had a number of cases in the civil rights context. You had these Supreme Court cases that were saying, hey, it sounds like you're being harmed by people manipulating your political districts. We agree. There was just a context at the time that sort of allowed cases to be in the favor of those who were claiming to be harmed by discrimination. But I'll fast forward to a time that might seem a little less progressive. There was a really important case decided in 2013 called Shelby County versus Holder. So there's this thing called the Voting Rights Act, established so that my not too distant ancestors would have the ability to vote, at least on paper. We can get into that in another episode. In the Shelby County case, the Supreme Court found that a part of the Voting Rights Act that required something called preclearance, which meant that state and local governments had to run their election law changes by the federal government, the Supreme Court found that that piece was unconstitutional. So this finding meant that states could pretty much have free reign in how they implemented election and districting laws. The rationale, BT-dub, was racism's over. The Voting Rights Act solved everything. You know we don't see color.
Classic American history. Oh, racism's over. Let's move on.
And yes, listeners, I am paraphrasing, and do your own research, as is the standard adage that we provide here at the show. But yes, Martin, you've heard a little bit about Shelby County. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, immediately when you said Shelby versus Holder, I was like, oh, that sounds familiar. But I could not tell you what it was about, even though we're doing this episode on a focus theme. It sounded like, and maybe run that by me one more time. It sounds like the decision was that basically states' rights.
Somewhat, although I think that could be maybe in a bit of an oversimplification. So essentially, one part of the Voting Rights Act, and keep in mind that was a fairly big piece of legislation. It required a lot of different changes to be implemented. One piece was that so that states weren't willy nilly just making up their own election laws and rules, they had to go to the federal government because, as you know from our reading of the Equal Justice Initiative, Reconstruction, and other materials, this is a great plug to read those resources, by the way. You know that the federal government oftentimes was more active in places throughout the South, especially after slavery ended and during the Reconstruction and Jim Crow periods. So, states who traditionally were known for kind of meddling in a way that made voting unfair for Black voters, they had to run their election changes by the federal government. That was the requirement within the Voting Rights Act. In the Shelby County case, the majority of the court decided you don't actually have to do that anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. So yeah, I cut out some of that middle piece. But of course, it all goes back to the history of our country in that there were these protections put in place, and we thought that racism was over, victory was won, and yet we kind of slid back into, well, flip that on its head. Yeah, racism's over. So let's go back to clearing the slate, so to speak, and not having these protections in place. So back that up. So Shelby County, where is Shelby County, and who is Holder? Or am I skipping ahead?
You're asking great questions. I'm going to take the second part of that question first because Eric Holder, was the Attorney General of the United States. Mm-hmm. Shelby County, sometimes you have to do on the spot research, listeners. And I read about this case in law school, which was some time ago. So I'm going to look up where Shelby County is.
And in classic layman fashion, I can ask questions and I can wait for the answer to be spoon fed to me. Looks like it's Memphis, Tennessee.
Tennessee. That sounds right.
Okay.
That sounds right. So it's not terribly shocking that the case involved an issue in the South because that is where we have historically seen the most, but not exclusively all, voting rights issues. And we're actually starting to see a resurgence of that today. We'll get into that later in the podcast.
It's almost as if, like, again, we're pointing back towards the history. It's almost as if culture doesn't change overnight, or even through the judicial system. There's always and always has been resistance to, progressive actions.
It's interesting you say that. I'd agree. I remember when we talked about the Shelby County case in my constitutional law class, the first thing I thought in mind was, is the Supreme Court really telling me that because something works, we no longer need it? That's the entire point of this pre-clearance requirement, to prevent what we're starting to see more and more because the requirement's not there. It's the same as saying, wow, you should stretch before you work out so you don't pull a muscle. You go 10 years without pulling a muscle and you're like, I don't need to stretch. I'm good. I'm bulletproof. When you pull a muscle inevitably from not stretching, you'll be like, you know what? I should probably take those proactive measures because they're needed as a foundational element of my success later on the playing field.
That's a fascinating take. I love how you framed it in that first place too, was, hey, this thing's working. We don't need it anymore. Like, yeah, it seems like such an easy, logical misstep.
So this was a case decided along ideological lines. Listeners might be familiar with the term 5-4 or 5-4 split, where an awfully hugely consequential case comes down to one person joining the majority, and the decisions often split between the conservative and liberal judges. At the time of the Shelby County case, there were 5 judges that leaned more conservative, so they made up the majority of the court. Martin, in this Shelby County case, or in other cases you've heard of where you've also noticed that there's been this 5-4 split, what are your thoughts? How do you feel about the very close margins that a Supreme Court case can be decided by?
Yeah, given this day and age, I have a ton of thoughts about the Supreme Court, even as a layman, as a law nerd. But yeah, it's fascinating that, as you put it, there are these major consequential decisions, and there's razor thin margins. Given the history in our lifetime of how the Supreme Court has behaved, too, it's unsurprising, I guess. And it's fascinating to and remind me, Shelby versus Holder was in 2013. So this was
Yes.
not that long. Like this is not like
Mhm.
when you think about, oh, there's a um, voting rights issue in the South. I think most Americans probably think of like Civil War, Reconstruction era, 19th century. You don't realize this is, 10 years ago, not very long, in the grander scheme of things. But it's fascinating. And yeah, of course, the Supreme Court has this unfairly heavy amount of influence in our lives. And again, they're razor thin margins. One person on the court is not a lot. That's not a very strong majority.
So you're bringing up the point that there's a lot of recency when we think about some of these issues. For some, at least, there's other folks who think, oh, these issues are done with. We've made progress. This is archaic stuff. Well, we're not done yet. And in fact, this year in 2024, another important case was decided. In Alexander versus South Carolina, a challenge was brought to South Carolina's congressional map, which in 2022 was redrawn so that areas with high populations of Black residents were split into much smaller parts, effectively ensuring that Black voters could not choose their preferred candidate and diluting the Black vote. The federal court in South Carolina, so think level 1 in a series of 3 levels to get to the Supreme Court, decided that the map was drawn to disadvantage Black voters in violation of the Constitution. So the level 1 federal court was like, I agree, this map isn't unconstitutional. But the current Supreme Court decided, in a decision with 6 judges in the majority and 3 in the minority, that the level 1 federal court got it wrong and that there was not sufficient evidence of race-based gerrymandering. Now, I did not read the full 104-page opinion because I'm not paid to research and podcast yet. Yes, Supreme Court opinions are usually quite long. So this is another time where we'll say, do your own research. There's another South Carolina case and a Mississippi gerrymandering case being argued before the Supreme Court. I personally, unfortunately, think the same conclusion will be reached. Martin, what are your thoughts on this Alexander case and about the other cases that are pending before the Supreme Court?
So for the audience, I had no idea what cases we were going to talk about in this. This was a little bit of a surprise. So it truly was a natural segue. I was like, oh my gosh, Shelby versus Holder. Like that was not that long ago, especially compared to, when racism ended after the Civil War. There's sarcasm just in case I didn't come across. So yeah, I mean, it's incredible. I think the first thing that also comes to mind is, wow, what a scenario. Like you could throw darts on a timeline of our history's country and say, oh, Southern state is fighting back against voting protections for citizens. Literally a tale as old as our country and our constitution. The second thing that came to mind was that the first court where this issue was heard decided one way. And to me, it just feels like, and maybe I've heard this too, there should be less intervening in those local places. Like I would think that closest to the issue would understand the issue the best. And I think unless it's an egregious violation of really justice, the appeals court shouldn't be taking these cases, right? Or they should at least give some weight to that first level court. I think that there is some like very strong mutual respect between courts and judges. So it's interesting that they found it the other way when these people closest to the issues decided one way, another way.
You're picking up on a lot of the issues that came to bear in Justice Kagan's dissenting opinion. Again, I did not read the whole thing, but she also talks about the importance of deferring to the district court and to the evidence that was presented in her view. And I tend to agree with this, again, not having read the full 104-page opinion or being present during the oral arguments, but it does seem like there's a very one-sided approach in the majority's opinion. Whereas, the district court made a decision based on evaluating both sides and determined that the map was unconstitutional. And to me, I think I would want to defer to a decision that's going to cause scrutiny in a local area. It's going to cause the people that draw these maps to work harder, to think about the impacts that they're having on voters' lives. But that is not what the majority opinion holds.
I thought it was interesting. You mentioned it was also a 6-3 decision, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I'd kind of be curious who decided what, although I could probably guess. But yeah, it's interesting that it seems as though that it was a stronger majority. But given the makeup of the court, there's those contextual nuances that maybe it's a little bit tighter.
It definitely sounds like we're going to need an episode or more on the Supreme Court. Its composition, what it means when a case is 5-4 versus 6-3 versus 9-0. There are unanimous opinions. We'll spend more time on that because I can imagine our listeners might be curious, and I know Martin is pretty curious as well.
Chomping at the bit over here. Episode 1.
So we kept things pretty high level and didn't get into all the details, but we wanted listeners to get a flavor of where we are with gerrymandering and how we got here. Martin, I'm curious. I am both a person who has studied law, gone to law school, has spent some time doing various advocacy projects, and as a Black person in the United States, this issue is relevant to me. So it could be that my experience and background just has me feeling like gerrymandering is super important. For you, though, aside from your general curiosity about legal topics, what makes you care? Why do you think that your average layman should care about this topic?
Yeah, I think, especially this time of year, election cycle, we are in an election year, and we're, less than 100 days from the U.S. national elections. I think it's important. It's always important to be informed. I think that's the first and foremost why we really started the podcast is to help demystify some of these ideas. And I think the more you know, the better off you are. Ignorance is bliss. And I joke in our intro that I am a layman and I'm ignorant, blissfully ignorant about how things actually work, which is true. However, that does a disservice to you. And I think, as I mentioned before, the real point that I think we could all agree on is that the foundation of democracy, the foundation of our country, these ideals that we've written down and at least and we argue about, but these ideals are that every person should have agency and advocacy for themselves. And the way that I think everyone agrees on, the way that we do that is through voting. So knowing that there are unfair advantages, as there are in so many ways and so many facets of life, but for this basic and foundational action that we have as citizens, like if you want to be a responsible citizen, you should vote, as mentioned earlier. But the fact that some people are being dissuaded or prevented from being represented is appalling. And I think, given political climates and whatnot, it can be a dangerous slope, and you can fall into an echo chamber where you're saying, well, the elections happen this way. You always have to look at the context. There's always another layer deeper to go into to say, well, why are elections this way? Are they fair? Are they representative of us as the people? The very first words in the preamble, we the people. I don't think it gets more foundational than that.
Very well said. And now we'll leave listeners with a call to action. If you live in a state where political maps are drawn to benefit certain classes, /races, and harm others, first, we're so sorry you have to experience that. We hope by raising awareness, folks will recognize gerrymandering or redistricting measures on local and state election ballots and will consider them carefully. Another call to action, be sure you sign up to vote. There's always a scenario in which your vote matters.
I think along those lines, check your registration based on your local state ordinances. There's a lot of trickery, frankly, going on from what I've seen in the news. So, again, layman here, take that with a grain of salt, but make sure that you are actually contacting your local government to make sure that you're registered and able to vote, and please participate. We live in a state where at least our vote in a lot of the national elections will probably go one way. I don't think they've changed in 20 some odd years in this state. However, I think it's still very important whether to exercise your voice, make your voice heard, and especially in those local elections where these people are going to have strong influence in your life. Get out and vote.
Finally, check us out at Lawyer and Layman Pod on Instagram and Lawyer and Layman pretty much everywhere else. Let us know if there's any topics you'd like us to explain. Don't walk around not knowing.